I think we should start by talking about some of the general trends.
Yes, so I have in front of me a comparison of the exit polls between the 2020 election and the 2024 election. These are from CNN, and basically I made a comparison of each demographic group over the two elections. So I want to just start going through each of these to sort of talk about which demographics shifted the most. So obviously the first thing we should start with is the racial category. So the biggest shift of this election undoubtedly was the Latino vote. According to these polls, they shifted 26% to the right. Asian Americans also shifted 12% to the right. And interestingly enough, Native Americans supported Trump by a 31% margin, whereas white voters stayed pretty much the same. In fact, it shifted about 1% to the left. And there was also speculation about African American voters that they would also see a large shift to the right, but it seems that didn't really happen. They shifted about 3% to the right, but it was nowhere near as significant as some of the other groups.
Interesting. So seeing that the Latino vote had the greatest variation between 2024 and 2020, was this a trend of Latino groups throughout the entire country, or were there perhaps certain counties or certain regions where Latino shifted heavily to the right, but then other regions stayed pretty much status quo?
So it was pretty much every single Latino majority county in the U.S. That's including places that are Mexican American, Cuban American, obviously with Miami-Dade County in Florida and stuff like that. So pretty much every single Latino group actually shifted right. Although of course the general trend of Cubans and South Americans being more supportive of Trump, and then Puerto Rican Americans and Mexican Americans more so for Democrats, pretty much stayed the same. We'll get to a little more of that as we go into each individual state.
Right. And I think it's interesting if you overlay that with especially Latino males, where I think for perhaps, I don't know if this is maybe one of the first times, but there's definitely an irregularity where the majority of Latino men ended up voting for Trump in 2024 by a margin of about 4%. 54% of Latino men ended up voting for Trump, which is a plus 18 gain from 2020. What is to be made of that? Why did that happen?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with just the emphasis of the campaigns. I think that nowadays a lot of minority voters are starting to shift towards the Republican Party. Obviously, abortion is a big issue amongst them, Latino voters. For instance, if we look at Catholic voters in general, they also saw a 23% shift rightward, and most of that has to do with Latinos, and most of that has, in my opinion, has to do with some of the rhetoric about abortion. As we know, Latinos are actually the most pro-life group in the U.S., not white Americans. So that certainly has something to do with it. And also, interestingly enough, a lot of Latino Americans put a lot of emphasis on immigration and the border. Yeah. Especially those who live amongst the border counties in Texas, Arizona, New Mexico.
Yes, that was particularly interesting. I think the border counties of Mexico and Texas, they ended up going red, did they not?
Yeah, so do you want to go right into some of the individual states so we can go into...
I think we'd take a second and focus on Texas for a second, while we're on the topic of it.
So let's talk about Texas a little bit. Most of the southern counties in Texas, which are pretty much 90-95% Latino, most of them saw over a 15% shift to the right. For instance, Maverick County saw a 28% rightward shift. Webb County saw a 25% rightward shift. El Paso County, with obviously El Paso in it, they shifted 20%. Donald Trump flipped the counties with Brownsville, McAllen, Laredo, and Raymondville, which are all very major cities that are all 90% Latino.
Were these counties traditionally blue?
Oh, yes, they were. In fact, some of these, I believe Maverick County and Webb County, but I think Maverick County has been voting blue every single election ever since 1892.
Wow.
And this is the first time they ever went red.
I would wonder then, with a lot of the what's been put out in the media that Trump has been very harsh on Latinos, very harsh on immigration, why would it be this demographic group that seems to have gone the hardest for him? I mean, besides from abortion, I'm surprised that with all the immigration rhetoric, it seems he's playing into the Latino vote.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting. I think it has to do with the fact that Latinos, especially after they become like citizens of the U.S., tend to be even more anti-illegal immigration than white Americans tend to be, is what I would say. And also, yes, there is definitely a difference between Latino men and Latino women, because Latino women only shifted 17% right. Well, I mean, I say only, that's still a huge shift, but yes. Latino men shifted 35% right. So there is also a big gender divide between Latino men and Latino women. But I don't know. What do you think are some of the other reasons why?
I tend to take the view that once Latinos become legal citizens in the U.S., or if you're a second or third generation Latino immigrant, or you could be a Latino who's been here since the founding days of this country, there is, I think, a mental difference between those who are what could be perceived as trying to cross the border and kind of reap the benefits that you and your kind of historical group have been trying to obtain and secure. And I think another thing is when you look back in history, especially during the union movements of the southern states of what's his name, Caesar. Who was that? Who was the Mexican American union leader? I think Caesar something, where he was like trying to unionize and put together the fruit pickers and the agricultural Hispanic workers. They are hard anti-illegal immigration because they view that it uproots a lot of their communities and undercuts them. And because of that, you do have this large anti-immigration wave amongst, I think, a lot of established Latino Americans in the United States.
Yeah. And the one other thing I'll say is I think this election is proof that for a while, even while Latino Americans were voting very strongly Democrat, they were still culturally conservative. And I think the reason why they had always been voting Democrats because they just had more of the message towards minority voters, right? Like before this, Democrats definitely had the coalition of most minority voters. And I feel like now that demographics are shifting and Latinos are becoming a larger and larger percentage, Republicans have shifted their message. They understand that the Latino vote is more and more important. And I think Donald Trump put a lot of emphasis on that.
Do you think that this will be a shift that is here to stay for some time, or do you think this is a one-off oddity or irregularity with regular voting habits of the Latino voter base?
I think it's a shift that will stay because I was actually very interested in what would happen this election because I know a lot of these southern Texas counties, they had already shifted like 40%, 50% right between 2016 and 2020. So I was coming into this election thinking, well, like I wonder if this trend will stay or if these counties are just going to end up shifting back. Well, as it turns out, these same counties that already shifted 40% right shifted another 20% right.
Interesting.
So
I think another statistic that you brought up before we started this podcast was interesting was the religious shifts. Not just we talked about the Catholic Latinos, for example, but when we talk about the atheists, Protestants, Catholics, and Jewish votes. Could you go into that?
yeah, so the main thing I noticed was that Catholics shifted right by 23%, and I'm assuming that the vast majority of that is due to the Latino shifts to the right. But the most interesting thing was that people who said none to their religious, so irreligious, atheist, agnostic, they shifted 11% to the left. So I find that very interesting, and I think this is indicative that there's starting to become a very big cultural divide between the two parties that's really feeding into the religious aspect as well.
Yeah, I do think it's very interesting how I think between these two parties, you're having, like you said, these shifts. There seems to be a gender shift, a clear gender split, especially amongst the youth. There seems to be a clear religious split, especially amongst like the Catholics and Protestants as compared to basically everyone else. I think the Jewish vote was, 78% for Harris?
Yeah, the Jewish vote remained pretty much the same.
It always was hard for Democrats. And then you also see the income gap leading to these large voting differentials. It seems to be on so many metrics. There seems to be clear cleavage, and people are picking their sides.
Yeah, certainly. It's difficult to really quantify whether or not this election was more of a unifying election or more of or if it caused these demographics to shift even more. Because on the one hand, most of the states that had the biggest rightward shifts were solidly blue states. And a lot of, like for instance, these a lot of minority groups that have historically been very strongly Democrat are starting to shift to the right. So one would look at that and might say, like these groups are starting to sort of come together, like neutralize a little bit. But on the other hand, when you look at some of these other demographics, like religion, for instance, like that's becoming a very polarizing one. Religion did not used to be as big of an issue as it is now. The fact that agnostics and atheists shifted 11% to the left in an election where the overall country shifted like 7% to the right, that's pretty significant.